Thank you so much for the introduction. As you mentioned, my name is Kat. I am the CTO of Kanopi Studios, and we're going to talk today about tracking and analytics tools and how to use them responsibly as owners of websites. So let's get going. As you mentioned, Kanopi, we are a full-service website digital agency. We take care of the full life cycle of open source websites for our clients, working in everything from kind of ongoing continuous improvements to sites, as well as full-scale rebuilds and redesigns. So it's a lot of fun. I get to see projects in a lot of different stages, and in kind of all of these sorts of engagements, a big part of what we do is discovery. And looking at the way users are using sites currently, and it's the analytics tools that enable us to do that. To put this in some context, I wanted to talk about, it is very seasonal, I know, so I have a spooky house up here. There's this cooperative board game that I play with my family. It's called Mysterium, where you are a group of internationally renowned psychics in the 1920s, and you're trying to help lay this ghost to rest, who was murdered in this super creepy house. The objective of the game is to derive kind of what the ghost wants to tell you about, it's clue-like, kind of the where, the who, and the what, right? Through pictures that it shares with you. So on its own, right, it's just that. It's a board game. It's one I highly recommend if you've never played it. It's a lot of fun. But you can also set this up to use atmospheric music and low lighting. And we have a ghost in our family who likes to knock once for yes and twice for no when answering questions. So it feels different, because it is different. You're using the same game in kind of a spooky, creepy way. You can ask my 10-year-old daughter about this, because I have actually been banned now from playing this game with her. In anything less than full daylight, we have to have like Shawn Mendes pop music on the stereo, and I have to be the most talkative ghost you have ever met. And online tracking can actually be a lot like this. These things are tools, and they can make the experience of your website better for a lot of people. But if you use them in an opaque way or an invasive way, without enough transparency and communication, they can have a really high creep factor that people don't want any part of. So today we're going to look at how users as a whole feel about the state of privacy versus personalization on the web, as well as looking at some of these tools and how to make sure that you're using them in the least creepy way possible. So let's talk a little bit about what users want. Let's talk about what today's context of digital interaction looks like and what the expectations are that are out there in the market. Many of these statistics come from a fantastic study that WP Engine actually sponsored that they did with the Center for Generational Kinetics. And I got super excited when I read it. So I'm going to share some of the highlights that I pulled out that really spoke to me in the context of tracking and analytics. And I do recommend that you check it out as well if you haven't read through it. 37% of users expect a user-centric experience on your site. So they think that websites are going to recognize and adapt to them and create an optimized experience that is tailored to them within the next 5 years. Along the same lines, the concept of a universal ID in users' minds is now a very real one. So this idea that within 5 years, at every level, a person will have an online footprint that is known across the web and is used to tailor sites to your unique needs and preferences. Because we know so much about them, therefore, 50% of these respondents expect you to know what they need before they do. They want that 5-star experience. In this particular segment, we're talking about Gen Z, which is also known as iGen and a couple of other names out there. But just to define it, we're talking about young people who were born in 1996 or later. So this is the up-and-coming folks who are going to really transform the way that we communicate our message and interact with our audiences online. And they are looking for this predictive experience on the web. What's also interesting, though, is of total respondents to this study, 62% of them want anonymity. They would prefer to have to select all of their options, all of their choices manually. if it meant they were completely anonymous. Different groups of users have different expectations of privacy, but it's important to everyone. And I find it really, really interesting, this dichotomy between what users expect and what they want. So what do they think is actually going to happen in 5 years versus deep down where they'd really like to be. So why is that? Why is anonymity so important to over half the respondents in this study, when we also feel like these predictive experiences, these personalized experiences are coming? What is it that the users fear? What is the context of this digital interaction? Well, we've all gotten burned. About 64% of people, this is a study done also in 2017 by the Pew Research Center, 64% of Americans have experienced a major data breach. And so when it comes to ensuring that experiences are safe, it's a huge concern for everyone. 2 of the top 3 least liked aspects of the web overall have this relationship with people's online security. 49%, regardless of whether they've actually experienced a problem or not, they feel vulnerable. They feel like their personal information isn't as secure as it was 5 years ago. The fact that everybody's got this universal access to their information, but they don't feel like they know where it is at any given point in time and who has it, right? And they consistently lack confidence in the security of their communications, the tools that they use online. And that lack of confidence as site owners who are genuinely trying to get out there and help, it puts up a barrier in our relationship. So it's important to remember that security and privacy are different. People are starting to make the transition where they understand that they have to give up some level of personal information to receive a personalized experience. That shouldn't compromise their security. So we're talking about privacy here in this context. And this young generation, these Gen Z folks, they are the ones that are really going to push that forward. The mindset around security from defensive to growth, and the idea that we're going to have to give something to get something. So that transparency of that relationship is incredibly important and is a big part of what we're going to talk about as we go through these tools. So how do we then give these users what they want while respecting what they need? One classic approach to getting user feedback on your website is just to ask them, right? So we pop up surveys, we make active requests for feedback, and these are fantastic and proactive sources of information. They're really great, but they get in the way of what the user actually came to your website to do, which ironically kind of flies in the face of good UX, which is the thing that we're trying to improve, right? By looking at all of this data. It's all about reducing those barriers and making it easy for them to accomplish goals. So how can we find out what they came here to do and reduce the friction that's caused by our quest for information? What passive observation techniques can we use to learn more about users without getting in their way? So what we're going to talk about here is tools and tactics, data, inputs that we use at our agency as a part of info gathering when we work with clients on website redesigns or growth plans, and how we implement and derive those insights on WordPress sites. So there are typically many focused fixes or changes that you can make immediately based on some of this information without starting over. So it's a great area to kind of incrementally improve things by leveraging your analytics data. So let's dive in. For purposes of our talk today, I have split this very scientifically into the not Googles and the Googles in terms of our tools. So I'm curious, who out here is using Google Analytics as your tool of choice? Okay. Who's not using analytics platforms at all? Okay, that's about what I figured. Google is really pervasive. It's a fantastic tool. It's free to use. So we're going to do a deep dive into some of the more advanced features of Google Analytics that you may or may not be aware of. But there are some more specialized tools and information sources that are not Google-based that are worth talking about first. So let's dive into the not Googles. One big thing I want to bring up is site search logging. Oddly enough, this is actually one of the most powerful sources of information we've found when it comes to finding out what your users are looking for. by logging people's search queries when they come to your website and they type it in your search box, what they're looking for, you get a crystal clear picture of highly searched content. You can start to think about ways to get your users to that content faster. You can promote popular content. You can create content calendars based on, like if you've got a lot of queries that are thematic, that's clearly an area that's of interest to your audience right now, so how can you bubble that up? It also gives you the ability to see what might be just buried, information you think is easy to find on your site that's critical part of your user's journey, but that they can't get to it. So it's a fantastic tool that's really simple to implement. You're also going to see here I have created another highly scientific structure called my creepometer, which is just a categorization technique, very rough, that I'm going to use throughout the talk to give you a high-level idea of how deeply personal we're getting with any of these individual tactics and how creepy it might seem to your users. So therefore, how important it is that you ask, not tell, but ask permission before you use these. A little bit more about site search. Beyond user feedback, it's actually huge. And since WordPress gives it to you out of the box, if you're not using it on your site, highly recommend just turning it on. You may not think you have enough blog posts or targeted content to merit it, but if there's any depth to your site, you might as well. The potential benefits are enormous. Interestingly, Forrester shows that 43% of people will use search first when they come to your site. So it's a great way to know exactly what, and when they come in, they know exactly what they want. So they actually convert better because they've landed on your site, they go to search, and they're looking for something specific. And generally speaking, from just a conversion standpoint, they're going to engage more deeply with your brand. They're going to convert at higher level of revenue or are more likely to close, and just depending on kind of what your pipeline looks like for connecting with your users. In terms of doing this, I like to give Relevancy a plug here because it's an excellent search plugin for WordPress. If you're not using it, highly, highly recommend it. It has a setting that will log search queries in the WordPress database. Now that does get bloated, so it's something that I recommend that you clean out on a semi-regular basis. But it'll do that heavy lifting for you, and it also gives you very relevancy-based search results that are excellent. So if this is something you're not using currently, I love it. And again, this ranks pretty low on the creepometer because you're able to do this without leveraging any third-party tools beyond just WordPress. Since this point is a little more topical than tool-based, I am going to dabble in my Googles here for a couple of these. I wanted to mention this particular feature before I really dive into those tools, because site search logging is also something that you can do within analytics. This is under your view settings. You can turn it on, and since WordPress typically just passes that Q in the URL with the search term, it's really easy to configure this for WordPress sites, and you can just do it within analytics without messing with anything else if you want to. Contact form analysis. So this is another one that's native to your site that you may not have thought about in the context of analytics and data gathering on your users. But what we have found is that it's a great tool because it's you and only you, and it's a direct conversation with your users. You might be a little surprised at how high I ranked this on the creepometer, but that's because you know exactly who this feedback came from. Like, there is nothing anonymous about this. They have a, they have a reply to email. But in aggregate, these kinds of communications can point to significant trends on your site. If there's something, again, that nobody can find, or FAQs that you're consistently answering, or even if it's an outlier, but it's a point of view that maybe you don't hear very often from a user with a particular challenge or a particular perspective. It's incredibly valuable and can lead to really significant gains in terms of understanding your users and their needs. The one thing I will say about this is, I did mention it's usually tied to personally identifying information, or PII. So just make sure that you don't keep this stuff hanging around in your database any longer than you have to. Visual behavior analytics is another area that we look at. This lets you see users interacting with your site. It's really, really cool. The primary tool here is heat mapping, which basically tells you what's hot and what's not from purposes of your page. You will see where people spend the most time interacting with your content, which, typically, like, for example, top left, your logo area is going to be bright, bright red, and you will have, like, nobody 3/4 of the way down your page scroll. So that's kind of what it is at a high level. And there's also a session recording aspect of this, where if you can't do actual user testing where you look over somebody's shoulder, and again, that's kind of an unnatural experience for them, you can use session recordings through these visual behavior analytics tools to watch them use your site. And it'll actually do a recording. You'll see their pointer go around. You'll see where they hover and pause, where they don't, what they actually click on, where they go to next, what they do there. It's incredibly powerful if you don't have the opportunity to kind of sit down with your users on a regular basis. The one that I use the most frequently is Hotjar. This is what we use to do our visualization analytics. Crazy Egg is another one of these tools that's really, really well known. I don't have a lot of depth of experience with it, so I won't vouch for it from a privacy perspective. But I am going to actually talk a little bit about what's a little bit creepy or not creepy about Hotjar. It gives you both those heat mapping visualizations. It gives you the session recordings. I'm not covering some of the other features of the tool in this talk because we don't use them as frequently for varying reasons. I went through their terms of service, their privacy policy, so y'all wouldn't have to. Found some pretty cool things that I thought I would share. They suppress all the keystrokes. They are GDPR compliant. Users can go to you can also facilitate this, but users can go to Hotjar's site. They can opt out of Hotjar running for them on any site, which is really nice because they can do it once and forget about it. And they don't keep their data for more than a year, which I really like. So I wanted to show some examples. These are heat maps. So when we talk about those hot areas on your site, what are people looking at? It provides a visual guide to the clicks and the movement and the scrolling. So there are 3 different kinds of heat maps that you can get to using these tools. And this is what a session recording will look like. So looking at the activity of an individual user, you can see exactly where they went, where they didn't click, where they stopped, and get a good idea of how they're digesting the content on your site. Hotjar does have a free plan, so if you're at all curious about it, it's something you can experiment with without committing. In terms of integration with your WordPress site, so how do you use these things? That's neat and all. Like many things, Hotjar has an official WordPress plugin that you can just plug in, add your ID, and be done. If you prefer to do it on a vendor, on a tool-by-tool basis. Again, just from a subject matter perspective, it's worth mentioning Google Tag Manager here, because Hotjar is actually one of their built-in tag types that's available, and so you can also set this up through Tag Manager if you're using that. It's a nice approach because it gives you a lot of granularity in terms of where you run things or conditions under which you run things. So if you are doing like GDPR compliance, for example, you can get much more granular with which trackers run and which don't if you're inside Tag Manager. And again, this is the not Google section, but this is actually my strongly preferred way to manage multiple tags and beacons is through a Tag Manager, having spent one too many years trying to chain callbacks on tracking analytics. So that's that one. I would be remiss not to mention in the not Google section that there are some incredibly robust other analytics platforms out there. And depending on how you feel about using Google tools or whether your organization doesn't let you use them, Matomo is one I've heard a ton about. If you use it, I'd love to chat with you after this because I actually haven't had the opportunity to dive into it for a client. So I don't have a lot of firsthand experience with these, but I'd be remiss not to mention them. There's a lot of great tools out there that are not GA that you can look at in terms of gathering analytics data on your own servers or on a different platform. So with that, now we will talk about the Googles. Google tools, so cool. They're free. They're incredibly powerful. You can get tons of insights. You can integrate your data sources using like Data Studio. They've got an incredibly broad reach. So when you look at benchmarking things in Google tools, you're pulling from a huge cross-section of people in your industry or your area. Problem is nothing is actually free. So Google, in their terms of service, actually states that they can use their content for your content for their existing and future services. If you do stuff on Google, in theory, they can use it in places you may not be aware of. Obviously, Google tools track you on other websites. They may also use device fingerprinting, which is a way of saying they can recognize your unique phone or computer based on the configuration of it. So even if you are a person that blocks trackers, based on your kind of unique profile of how you've got Chrome set up, it can be really interesting to go and see that if you're running JavaScript, they can basically still figure out who you are, not to make everybody paranoid. I have to do a hat tip here to the site TOSDR, which stands for Terms of Service Didn't Read. It gives great high-level analysis of this stuff for common trackers. So if you're using like Twitter things or Facebook things or Google things, they're all out there. And my information on kind of the creepy stuff for Google came from them. There's a link in these slides, which I'll also be posting to Twitter after this talk. It is an open source project, so if trackers you use are not out there on TOSDR, I know they would love to have your support, and you can help make it easier for others. But that's the source of this information. So Tag Manager. How many folks out there are already using Tag Manager if you're using analytics? Okay, not as many. It's fantastic, no lie. It's a container. It's going to help you manage a whole bunch of tags in one place. It's deeply, deeply integrated with Google Analytics. Some of the advanced features we're going to talk about with GA are much easier to implement via Tag Manager than they are via Analytics directly. And there are a lot of tracking tools like Hotjar that have these out-of-the-box configurations. And you don't have to be as developer-heavy to leverage the platform. One of the things I've been doing a lot of in Tag Manager lately that I really, really like is this ability to strategically set up all the subtags in your Tag Manager so that they only fire based on user consent given. So I can then start grouping tags into types, and I can give users the opportunity to opt out of certain types of tracking, and I can make sure those are turned off based on their preferences without having to do anything crazy in code. Google Tag Manager for WordPress is my favorite tool for doing this implementation easily. It also makes it, one of the things I love about it, the reason I really love it, is it makes it very straightforward to write a bunch of helpful information to the data layer that you can use in conjunction with other features of GA. So the data layer is kind of the key to getting customized information into analytics. So you can see here, for example, in the screenshot, it gives you the ability to include author information or category information, or things that you might then in analytics want to turn around and say, well, who are my most popular authors? What is about their style that's resonating for people? Using the data layer with GA can give you those kinds of insights. Search Console is another one I love to bring up. If you're not using Search Console and you are using analytics, this is really, really easy to turn on. You do it under your property settings or from your acquisition menu, but we've all seen this probably at some point. The not provided keywords that make up like 90% of your search traffic. The way you get to that information is through Search Console. Search Console will actually have the breakdown of what's in that area. If I understand it all correctly, this is because searches that are run over a secure connection don't show up here, but they will show up in console. So once you have that integrated with your analytics, you have the ability to access that data from within analytics, which is really handy. Campaign tracking is another one that, depending on how you interact with users, this can be a great source of information about different types of users, where they come from, and what they like to do on your site. So for example, if you're running specific campaigns, ad campaigns, or content campaigns in Facebook, and you're also sending some of those links out in your email newsletters, you can see whether the people coming from Facebook resonate with that better than the people that are coming from email, for example. And campaign tracking lets you do that. Again, there's links at the end of the deck to this campaign URL builder, which will help you get all the parameters right in terms of building those URLs that you can then plug into your ads or your email newsletters or whatever it is that you want to track. But this will let you segment by the campaign itself. So if you've got a seasonal thing that you're running or what have you, the source of your traffic, so was it your newsletter or was it Facebook? And then the medium, which is typically going to be, like whether it was like an email thing or a banner ad or what have you. Okay, so custom dimensions. This is what I was referring to when I talked about the data layer. And custom dimensions are something that I know a lot of people haven't messed with, so they're worth talking about. This is getting a little higher on the creepometer. Because now what we're doing is we're looking at customized information about an analytics hit. The data has to be populated on the data layer via external means, like WordPress, so by using like the Tag Manager plugin. And you can then take that piece of data and you can assign it a scope. You can say this is a hit scope, a user scope, or a session scope. So a hit scope would be on this page, I want to record this information, right? A user scope would be, now that I've cookied this user, every time this user does something, this piece of data shows up. And your session scope would be, while they're on the site this time, I want to keep track of this piece of information. And then when you run custom reports in analytics, you can actually use this information as a primary dimension for filtering those reports. Demographics data. Now we're getting really creepy. You can turn this on. It's a checkbox. It can help you identify high-value segments of your audience. You cannot use it in conjunction with user ID tracking, which I'll cover in just a minute. This also does integrate with AdWords. The important thing to know about user demographic tracking is it does require updates to your privacy policy if you choose to turn it on. Some folks are able to use it, some folks are not. But what this is going to do is it's going to look at average age of your audience, average, what the breakdown of gender for your audience. It'll tell you things like what are they in the market for right now, if that information is available, like in terms of types of products or types of services. It'll tell you what are their interests. So really powerful, getting a little creepy, but you can then use it to do levels of audience segmentation. So crafting these market segments that you can then run reports against. User ID integration, this is pretty much my highest thing on the creepometer. It is really cool. I have started implementing it for some clients specifically who are doing tracking around like membership models and like what members like to work with, or different types of members, different levels of members, what have you, from a content perspective. The big things to know is it cannot contain any personally identifying information and must be a random identifier. That said, you can use typically user IDs that are tied to your CMS platform do qualify. I verified that. There are obviously a lot of wrong and creepy ways to handle this one. So, considerations. So this is my mini rant. I'll try to keep it to a minimum for you. But how creepy are you? You need to know the regulations that apply to your business and be transparent about the trackers that you're using. Make it accessible for people to understand what you're doing. Only keep the stuff as long as you need it. And again, I highly encourage looking at ways to configure your trackers to allow people to opt out at a more granular level. The whole, by using my site, you agree to everything I want to do, is kind of not a lovely thing to do to people, and actually isn't compliant with some things in terms of privacy regulations. And you also got to make it as easy for them to get out as it is for them to get in. Because if on Tuesday they feel like being tracked and on Wednesday they don't, we've got to respect that. Another one is accessibility of your trackers. So this is something we've run into. I actually was working with a client. We tried to run a pop-up survey, and it turned out that pop-up survey, they had a big focus on blind users, and with keyboard navigation, they couldn't close it. They couldn't get around it. They couldn't actually access the page content. It's a nightmare. So testing with screen readers, testing with assistive navigation, testing with your tracking blockers enabled. So for people that like to do it at that global level, your site functionality shouldn't be affected by that. So these things need to be implemented on your site in non-blocking ways. And consider the performance. You might be shocked at sometimes I'll pull together a laundry list of all the trackers that are running on a site. People have no idea that this stuff is even on there, and they have no idea why. It's kind of terrifying. So only track what you need for as long as you need it. This is one of my rants, but to this exact point, there is a certain house for a certain mouse. That is a recent personal example of the pain of not planning for these preferences, because as you might expect from this talk, I am a online privacy nut, and I use VPNs and secure browsers, and I come with my own hotspot, and I'm that person, and I block every tracker in creation. And I am actually taking my family here in March, and we're doing like a big trip. So you're like, I have to add all these people so that I can make all these reservations and like do all these things. Turns out, you can't do that if you block trackers. It doesn't work. I can't actually click the add a person to my planning party button and have it go anywhere. So I'm fundamentally blocked from using the tool by choosing not to be tracked. Now, obviously, I grumbled, looked at the console, turned things on, did what I had to do to make it run, but the question is, should I have to do that? So, this is that awareness component. What are you using on your site today? Do you know what all is out there? Do you understand what their privacy and data retention practices are? Because that will in turn affect you. So knowing your widgets. Tools like this can lead to these inception-like scenarios too. So make sure you know what your partners, what your tools are doing behind the scenes when they're included on your site. I was recently debugging an analytics implementation, and I asked a bunch of folks to jump on it so I could kind of see on the real-time dashboard what was happening. And one of my devs came to me and was like, wait, we're running 2 ID codes. And I'm like, oh, no, we're not. You see that widget in the footer? It's running its own tracking. That's what you're seeing. So, ask me how I feel about widgets. But, and now you all know how I feel about it, but because we are here. So, in closing, I want to say that, you are just as creepy as your partners. So we can look at the creepy factor. We can say, we're not creepy, but if the tools we use are creepy, then we have a problem. So not all these tools are created equal. These widgets and things we include on our site can be a window into somebody else's ethics, and few things are truly free. So while these tools are incredibly powerful, just make sure you're using them responsibly. Use that data to make users' worlds better, but make sure that you're sharing the information with them on what you're doing and why. In the immortal words of Reading Rainbow, don't take my word for it. References and resources, so a lot of the research that I cite or the tools that I've mentioned are listed here. And again, I'll be posting these slides up on Twitter after the session today. Thank you. Oh, you want me to go back? Got it. All right. So there's my Twitter handle. I love to talk about this stuff. Please reach out. I'm happy to connect after this, or if you've got questions, we can talk about them now. Okay, we have 10 minutes for questions.
Signal if you have a question, I'll bring you the mic.
That's actually the incorrect slide URL. So I will update that in the deck and put out an updated one on Twitter.
So, close enough, there we go. So you mentioned giving users like an ability to sort of like granularly opt out of things. I personally myself just like have my VPN on, like JavaScript off unless I need it. I'm like, I hate like 90 pop-ups asking me different things throughout my experience. I do get the idea of like, yes, I'd much rather have granular control of it, but like how do you hit the balance between like your user not having to hit a new button, like a new opt in or out on every page load? Like how do you handle that granular control that you mentioned?
I'm getting a lot of reverb on the question. Can you try maybe repeating it with the mic closer?
Hello. Okay.
Perfect,
so
thank you.
How do you hit the balance between not having to constantly basically having a click-through conversation with the user about what they do agree to or not, and actually giving them the ability to have that granular control over their privacy? That is not just like yes to everything or no opt out of the website.
Right. There's a tool, and I can validate myself here. OneTrust is a cookie management tool that's GDPR compliant that actually gives you the ability to like, you click on manage my settings, and it's like, so it's a pop-up banner like you're used to. You click on manage my settings, and then you can check or uncheck checkboxes for certain categories of tracking. And I really like that approach because they do it once and they forget about it. And then on the tag manager side, which is typically where I'm doing it, I can look at which checkboxes they said yes to and no. And I also recommend keeping track of that consent, like store that in your platform that they gave it, then I can turn things off or on.
I had a client ask about like a B2B lead identification tool, and I know there are some out there. Are those ethical in your opinion, and have you worked with any of those?
So getting kind of into the big data scenario. I don't love them. I haven't worked with them directly, so I don't have personal insights on the subject. From an ethics perspective, I just tend to think if people know they're opting in to being a part of that kind of big data model, that kind of platform, fine, great. You know, if they've expressly put their information out there, I'm fine with it. I guess what I worry about are some of these things that are like, I don't know. I don't know that people know how far their data really goes into those kinds of systems. So I don't love them, but I certainly understand why they're there. And I guess B2B, for me, I feel a little bit differently about it in some ways than I do B2C. Whether I should or not is another point. Yeah, way in the back.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, could you speak about like crafting a privacy policy? A super common thing for us is like we install Google Analytics. That's like it. And I have no idea really what we're collecting. And I know that they're not doing anything with it, but like we want to be proactive with this. So like, how do we go about doing this?
So typically, one of the nice things about GA, if you're just running vanilla GA, all you really have to have, and I should caveat this, not a lawyer, programmer. So take everything I say on the subject of what belongs in your privacy policy with a grain of salt, please. That said, my understanding is if you're running kind of vanilla Google Analytics, as long as you're expressing in the privacy policy that we're just collecting it, like basically you just say something to the effect of, we don't collect any personally identifying information, we're just looking at traffic metrics. You know, we're not doing anything else. We're not selling your data. We're not doing anything else with your data. It's strictly for traffic information about usage on the website. You're cool. These features that we talked about in terms of user ID tracking and demographics tracking and a lot of these more personal features of analytics, they're all turned off by default. So if you haven't turned them on, you're good. There's not, you know, there are things that just like your users, you have to opt into as an organization. I don't know if that helps. And then once you do, you can start to kind of say, oh, and by the way.
Does every website need to have a privacy policy?
Yes.
And where should it be?
People expect it linked in the footer. That's the most common UX pattern. Another thing I highly recommend doing is if you run contact forms or you collect information at all about people, go ahead and have a link to the privacy policy there in the form where you ask for their email address. Make just a little statement that says, hey, I know you, you're a human, I care, I'm not doing anything funky with your email. It'll also help your conversion rates too.
Hi there. I work at enterprise level WordPress, and I'm interested in using some of these tools to apply them to WP admin and optimize the experience for our editors and our content creators. And I wondered if you have any experience or any recommendations of tools for doing that.
That's a really cool idea. I have not done that myself, but I would think that while most of our plugin solutions in the WordPress environment are going to be audience facing, you could certainly you could use your same analytics platform for admin facing as well, and just insert it into the head of the document for admin pages only, and then do this same kind of tracking. I might actually run it as a separate ID just to make the reporting simpler. Like, I don't know that I would combine my analytics or my administrative experience with my consumer-facing experience, but I have to think about that. But what you can then do is actually start logging things like the user role to the data layer and starting to use that information to figure out where people are getting hung up.
I have a question. Have you seen the WordPress core feature plugin proposal for consent and logging? And if so, do you have any thoughts about it?
Sorry, seen the what?
The feature plugin proposal for consent and logging mechanism for WordPress.
I haven't.
Okay.
I will have to check that out.
Yeah.
So I do not yet have an opinion, but I will shortly.
Well, I'd love to hear your opinion once you see it.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could speak toward site speed regarding analytics tools. We have clients at my company that they want to throw all of these tracking tools on there, and then they get upset when it gives them a 10-point hit on page speed insights. Is there a way to achieve kind of a balance on that?
I'm sorry. For some reason, the echo on the mic is making it hard for me in some of these cases to understand. Could you repeat that for me?
Sorry. Regarding site speed.
Yes.
Okay. We have clients that will, they want all of these tracking codes on their site, and then they get upset when it affects their speed scores. Is there a way to achieve sort of a balance in that?
Oh, man. I haven't found the magic solution to that yet. There are a couple of approaches I take. One, I look at it as, is this tracker the only way to get this information? Can we leverage something we already have? Can we write a custom report? Can we add something to the data layer? Can we do something in our current platforms without adding yet another thing? If the answer to that is no, then it becomes a question of how bad do you want it? Because there's only so much we can do about page speed. I mean, obviously we can defer loading on all of these things so they get the content first. But yeah, the reality is you'll put some, especially I've noticed it with like social tracking, you stick it on there and like your page speed just tanks and there's nothing you can do about it. So I have literally gone back to the client and said, okay, this is the net average effect it's having on page speed. How bad, say it more politely, but I'm like, how bad do you want it? Is it worth this sacrifice? Because sometimes it is, and that's great. But if I don't have another way to get that information, then that's just a choice they have to make. Unfortunately, I haven't found a good solution for that one yet.
Time for just one last question. Time for no last questions.
All right. Great questions, y'all. Thank you so much.